For most of her life, Valerie Bertinelli believed she understood where she came from. She grew up hearing stories about her family, about the grandfather who immigrated from Italy and helped shape the American branch of the Bertinelli name. But decades later, a single television appearance changed everything she thought she knew about her own ancestry. What began as a simple curiosity about family history quickly uncovered a secret that had been hidden for more than a century. And as Valerie began piecing together the truth, it raised a complicated question about identity, family, and the legacy people leave behind. Long before Valerie Bertinelli became a familiar face on American television, the roots of her story began in a small Italian town. Her paternal grandfather, Nazareno Bertinelli, lived a life that seemed straightforward from the perspective of the family who knew him in the United States. Valerie remembered him as a quiet figure from her childhood, a man who had immigrated to America and built a new life. Like many immigrants of his generation, he carried stories from the old country that were rarely discussed in detail. For most of her life, Valerie assumed that the narrative was simple. Her grandfather left Italy, came to the United States, married her grandmother, Angelina Croce, and started the family that would eventually include Valerie's father and the rest of the American Bertinelli relatives. But the deeper truth was far more complicated. Decades later, Valerie decided to explore her ancestry through the genealogy series Finding Your Roots, hosted by historian Henry Louis Gates, Jr. The program is known for using historical records, immigration documents, and family archives to uncover long-forgotten stories about the ancestors of well-known public figures. When Valerie joined the show, she expected to learn details about her grandfather's journey from Italy to Pennsylvania. What she did not expect was that the investigation would reveal a hidden chapter of his life that had never been mentioned inside the family. Researchers began examining records from Italy dating back to the period after the First World War. That was when the first surprising discovery appeared. Documents showed that Nazareno Bertinelli had married a woman named Domenica Kellerani in his hometown shortly after returning from military service. The marriage certificate listed the date clearly, confirming that the ceremony took place not long after the war ended. When Valerie read the name during the show, she immediately realized something was wrong. The woman listed on the record was not the grandmother she had grown up knowing. Angelina Croce was the grandmother Valerie remembered from family stories. Yet, the official document revealed that her grandfather had married another woman first. The moment stunned her because the existence of this earlier marriage had never been mentioned by anyone in the family. It meant that the story Valerie had believed for decades was missing an entire chapter. What made the discovery even more astonishing was the timeline that followed. Within a short time after marrying Domenica Kellerani, Nazareno left Italy and boarded a ship bound for the United States. Immigration records showed that he arrived in Scranton, Pennsylvania, beginning a new life far from the town where he had just started a marriage. On the paperwork he completed when entering the country, he listed himself as single. There was no reference to the wife he had left behind. That decision would shape the lives of two families on opposite sides of the Atlantic, and Valerie Bertinelli was only beginning to understand how deeply that hidden history would affect her view of her own family. The discovery of Nazareno Bertinelli's first marriage was shocking enough, but the story did not end there. As researchers continued examining the historical records connected to Valerie Bertinelli's family, another detail emerged that made the situation even more complicated. The marriage between Nazareno Bertinelli and Domenica Kellerani had not simply been a brief union that ended quietly. In fact, it had produced a child. That child's name was Ernesto Bertinelli. According to the documents uncovered during the research process, Domenica gave birth to Ernesto only several months after Nazareno departed for the United States. The timeline suggested that the child was conceived before Nazareno left Italy. Yet by the time Ernesto entered the world, his father was already thousands of miles away, starting a new life in America. For Valerie, hearing this information for the first time created an immediate emotional reaction. Until that moment, she had never known that she had a half-uncle who spent his entire life in Italy. The idea that an entire branch of the family existed across the ocean, separated by decades of silence, was difficult to absorb. The story grew even more poignant when the researchers explained what happened to Ernesto as he grew older. Historical records and family correspondence suggested that Ernesto had attempted to connect with his American relatives many years later. He reportedly wrote letters to members of the Bertinelli family in the United States, hoping to establish contact with the father he had never known and the relatives he had never met. But it appears that those attempts never resulted in a reunion. Ernesto lived his life in Italy and eventually passed away without ever meeting his father or his half-brother in America. For Valerie, learning about this forgotten relative was perhaps the most emotional moment of the entire experience. As she listened to the story, she began imagining what Ernesto's life might have been like growing up without the presence of his father. She wondered what it must have felt like for a child to know that his father had left for another country and never returned. Even though the historical context of immigration during that era was complicated and often harsh, the emotional impact on the people left behind could still be profound. Valerie spoke openly about how the situation made her feel. She expressed sadness not only for the lost connection between Ernesto and the American side of the family, but also for the emotional burden that abandonment can place on a child. She reflected on the painful thoughts that often cross a child's mind when a parent disappears. The quiet fear that perhaps they were not loved enough to make the parent stay. Of course, Valerie also recognized that the full story of her grandfather's life might never be completely understood. People living through the aftermath of war, economic hardship, and immigration often made decisions that seemed impossible to explain decades later. Instead of judging her grandfather harshly, she tried to approach the situation with empathy, acknowledging that his life must have contained struggles she could only guess at. Still, the fact remained that for more than a century, the Bertinelli family had carried a hidden history that no one had spoken about. And now that secret was finally out in the open. For Valerie, the discovery forced her to rethink the meaning of family history, inheritance, and legacy. Because sometimes the most powerful things people pass down through generations are not money or property, but the stories that were never told. As Valerie Bertinelli processed the revelations about her grandfather, the experience forced her to reconsider something deeper than genealogy. It was not just about discovering a forgotten marriage or an unknown relative. It was about understanding how the choices of one person generations ago could ripple through an entire family history. The story that emerged from the research showed how easily pieces of the past can disappear, leaving later generations with only fragments of the truth. After leaving Italy and arriving in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Nazareno Bertinelli began building the American life that Valerie's family had always known. Several years after immigrating, he applied for a marriage license again. This time the woman listed on the paperwork was Angelina Crosa, the grandmother Valerie had grown up hearing about. On the official documents, Nazareno declared that he had never been married before. That single detail made the discovery even more complicated. If the records were accurate, it meant that the earlier marriage to Domenica Kellerani had been completely erased from the version of his life that existed in America. Whether this was done intentionally or simply out of a desire to start fresh in a new country is impossible to know now. What is clear is that the truth remained hidden for decades. Valerie herself admitted that the revelation left her with many unanswered questions. She wondered whether Angelina had ever known about the first marriage. If she had discovered the truth, it might have changed how she saw the man she married. But Valerie said she doubted that her grandmother was aware of it at all. If she had known, the situation could have been very different for the family. For historians like Henry Louis Gates Jr., stories like this are not uncommon when researching immigrant families from the early 20th century. During that era, many people crossed oceans in search of economic survival or a new beginning, and official paperwork often contained incomplete or misleading information. Some immigrants reinvented themselves entirely when they arrived in America. In many cases, the truth only resurfaces generations later when modern research tools uncover records that had been forgotten. For Valerie Bertinelli, however, this was not just another historical case study. It was her own family, and the emotional weight of that discovery stayed with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. She explained that learning about Ernesto changed the way she thought about her grandfather. Instead of seeing him only as the man she remembered from childhood, she now saw him as a complicated human being who had made decisions that affected many lives. Rather than judging him harshly, she said she was trying to approach the story with compassion. She imagined the difficult circumstances people faced after the war, the economic uncertainty, and the pressure to survive. Perhaps those factors played a role in the choices he made. Perhaps the distance between continents made it easier for secrets to remain buried. Still, the existence of Ernesto remained a powerful reminder that family history is rarely as simple as it appears. For Valerie, the discovery also sparked a deeper reflection about legacy. When people talk about inheritance, they often think about money, property, or possessions passed down through generations. But the story of the Bertinelli family revealed another kind of inheritance entirely. The inheritance of truth. Because sometimes what families pass down is not wealth or status, but the hidden stories that eventually resurface when someone finally begins asking questions. While the discoveries about her ancestors were unfolding, Valerie Bertinelli's own life had already been filled with dramatic chapters that often placed her in the public spotlight. For decades, her name appeared in headlines not only because of her career, but also because of the complicated personal history surrounding love, marriage, and loss. In many ways, the emotional weight she felt when learning about her grandfather's secret reflected the kind of empathy that had grown from her own experiences. Valerie first became widely known to the public while still very young through her role on the television sitcom One Day at a Time. Her success on the show turned her into a recognizable face across the country and established the foundation for a long career in television and entertainment. But her life outside of acting soon attracted just as much attention. In the early years of her fame, Valerie married rock guitarist Eddie Van Halen. At the time, the relationship between the television star and the legendary musician fascinated fans from two completely different worlds of entertainment. Their marriage lasted many years and the couple welcomed a son together, Wolfgang Van Halen. Although the relationship eventually became strained and the couple separated before formally divorcing later, they remained connected through their son and maintained a respectful bond over the years. When Eddie Van Halen passed away, the loss affected Valerie deeply. She spoke openly about the emotional difficulty of that period and the complicated feelings that come with losing someone who had once been such an important part of her life. Even though their marriage had ended long before, they had shared decades of memories and the experience without second.